I used to believe love could survive anything, even betrayal, even silence. Her name was Anna, and she was my entire world. At least, that's what I told myself back then. We had been married for 10 years when I first sensed the shift, that delicate fracture in the rhythm of our days. She began working late, laughing at messages she didn't show me, wearing perfume she hadn't touched in years. I didn't need to ask. A man always knows when he's being replaced. The day I found out about her affair, I felt neither rage nor despair, just an unbearable stillness, like dust settling after a collapse. The man she was seeing was her colleague, a curator, younger, ambitious, full of the passion I had once carried before time and routine dulled my edges. I packed my brushes, my old sketchbook, and left our apartment before dawn. I didn't leave her a note. There was nothing left to explain. For years, I had been a restorer of forgotten beauty. Frescoes, murals, sacred fragments buried beneath centuries of decay. I knew how to bring color back to the dead. But I couldn't restore us. When an old friend wrote to me about a monastery high in the mountains, asking if I could help restore its crumbling walls, I took it as a sign, a kind of quiet salvation. I drove there with nothing but my tools and a heart that felt like winter stone. The monastery was ancient, older than memory. Its corridors breathed with incense and echoes. The monks welcomed me with simple warmth, offering bread, silence, and space. I began my work in the chapel, where centuries of candle smoke had swallowed the faces of the saints. Each day, I scraped away layers of soot, unveiling fragments of color, blues that once sang of heaven, gold that still shimmered faintly in the light. The work was slow, sacred. I slept little, spoke less. In that silence, something began to shift within me. At first, I thought I was only restoring the wall. But slowly, as the faces of angels emerged from beneath the darkness, I realized I was restoring myself. One morning, while cleaning a small section near the altar, I uncovered a figure I hadn't noticed before. A woman's face, serene, luminous, painted with tenderness. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, yet her lips curved in forgiveness. I remember staring at her for hours, unable to look away. It felt as if she were watching me, not judging, not pitying, but seeing through the noise of my grief. I began to dream of her. In those dreams, she spoke without words, reminding me of something I had forgotten, that beauty survives even after love dies. Months passed, the seasons changed, my hands grew steady again. I learned the rhythm of the monastery, the bells at dawn, the chanting at dusk, the quiet laughter of the brothers over tea. I no longer carried anger toward Anna, only gratitude, strange, unexpected gratitude, because her betrayal had led me here. When the restoration was finally complete, I stood in the chapel alone, staring at the reborn walls. The saints, the angels, the colors, all of it was alive again. And so was I. That night, I wrote for the first time in years. At first, I only meant to record the process, the techniques, the pigments, the discoveries. But the words came differently. They came as confessions, as prayers, as fragments of my own resurrection. Those pages became my first book, The Silence of Color. I didn't expect anyone to read it. Yet somehow, it found its way into the world, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Letters began arriving, from strangers who said the story had healed them, who said it gave them hope after their own ruins. Now, years later, I live in a small cottage near the same monastery. I still restore, still write. I no longer ask why things happened the way they did. Some cracks aren't meant to be filled. They let the light in. Sometimes, I walk into the chapel at dawn, when the first light touches the frescoes. The woman's face still watches me. Her eyes are calm, forgiving, eternal. And I understand, finally, that love isn't about possession or permanence. It's about presence. It's about the colors we leave behind in the silence. It was early spring when she arrived. The snow had begun to melt, and the river that wound through the valley whispered like a secret returning home. The monastery had opened its gates for a small group of visitors, art historians, pilgrims, seekers. Among them was a woman who carried herself with the stillness of someone who had lived through her own storm. Her name was Elena. She wasn't extraordinary in the way that beauty often announces itself. Her hair was tied carelessly, her clothes simple, her face untouched by artifice. But her eyes, they held a depth that silenced me. They were the color of the earth after rain, and they seemed to understand things before words could name them. She told me she was researching medieval pigments, writing a thesis on the symbolism of color in sacred art. We spoke at first about frescoes, techniques, minerals, the ancient patience required to make color from dust. But our conversations soon wandered elsewhere, into music, solitude, forgiveness. Elena had a voice that lingered, like the echo of a hymn. She asked me once if I believed restoration was only about reviving what was lost. I told her no, it was also about discovering what was hidden. The same, I said, was true for the heart. She smiled at that, though there was sadness in her smile. Days passed. She stayed longer than she had planned, offering to help catalog the finished frescoes. We worked side by side in silence, the way two people sometimes do, when words would only disturb the fragile peace between them. I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. A trembling, a quiet awakening, as if the soul were remembering the language of touch. One evening, the monks invited us to share supper in the refectory. Candles flickered on the long wooden table. The scent of bread and herbs filled the air. After the meal, we stepped outside. The night was clear, the stars sharp as glass. She looked up, her breath visible in the cold. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked. I thought of Anna, of the years we built and broke, of the ache that had once consumed me. And then I realized that I didn't miss it. Not anymore. "I think I only miss the man I was before I forgot how to feel," I said. Elena turned to me, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. "Then maybe you've found him again." We didn't touch, we didn't need to. The air between us carried everything that mattered. In the weeks that followed, we became quiet companions. She read aloud from old journals of painters long dead, their words speaking of devotion, patience, and longing. I painted small sketches for her, not of saints or angels, but of simple things. The curve of a candle flame, the shadow of her hand on stone, the fragile bloom of a wildflower in the courtyard. When she left, she pressed a folded note into my palm. "For later," she whispered. Inside was a line, written in delicate handwriting. "Some walls are meant to be restored. Others are meant to be opened." I never heard from her again, but the world she awoke in me didn't fade. It deepened. Because of her, I began to paint again, not for work, but for love. Not for the past, but for the light that still lived in the cracks of it. Years have passed since then. The book continues to find new readers. Strangers still write to me, though I live quietly, almost forgotten by the noise of the world. And sometimes, when dawn breaks through the narrow window of my studio, painting the dust in gold, I see her face for a moment in the light, not as memory, but as presence. Elena, like the frescoes, remains in the wall of my heart, restored, unfinished, eternal. Time, I've learned, doesn't heal. It softens. It smooths the edges until pain becomes texture, part of the whole design. 5 years passed after Elena left the monastery. 5 years of silence, of work, of slow and tender rediscovery. My book had long since made its way into the world, translated, quoted, loved, in ways I never anticipated. People came from distant places to see the restored chapel, to stand beneath its reborn colors. I watched them quietly from the side, as one watches the tide come and go. I had grown used to solitude, not as punishment, but as a kind of devotion. Every morning I walked the narrow path behind the monastery, where the mist rose from the valley and the air smelled of pine and stone. I spoke little, but I listened, to wind, to water, to the faint heartbeat of the earth. One autumn afternoon, as I was preparing materials for a new commission, a nearby church had asked for help restoring a damaged icon. I received a letter. It was simple, handwritten, sealed with a trace of blue wax. The handwriting was unmistakable. I am in Florence. I'm curating an exhibition on sacred art and memory. Your work is here. Your frescoes, your story. They asked me to write the introduction. Will you come? I must have read the letter a dozen times. My hands trembled, as they had not in years. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the Uffizi Gallery, surrounded by centuries of light turned into color. The city hummed with life, with bells and laughter and the scent of rain on cobblestone. And then, there she was, Elena. Time had touched her gently. There were faint lines around her eyes, the kind drawn by laughter and tears, not by age. Her hair was shorter, streaked with silver, but her gaze, that quiet, knowing gaze, remained the same. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that seemed to bridge every lost year between us. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure I'd be able to stay away, I replied. We walked through the gallery together. On the walls hung fragments of centuries, saints, lovers, angels, griefs, all preserved in fragile pigment. And then we reached the small section dedicated to the monastery. My frescoes, my saints, my reborn colors. Beneath them hung a placard with words I didn't recognize at first, until I realized they were hers. To restore is not to return something to what it was, but to help it remember what it has always been. I felt my chest tighten. She had understood everything I had tried to say, and more. After the opening, we walked through the city in silence, beneath a sky turning violet. The Arno reflected the lights like trembling gold. We stopped on the Ponte Vecchio, where musicians played softly. I thought of you often, she said finally. Every time I looked at a piece of broken art and saw beauty in it, you taught me that. I thought of you every day, I admitted. Every time I saw light touch a wall. She turned to me then, and there was something unguarded in her expression, a quiet surrender, the kind that comes only after both hearts have been humbled by time. I don't know if we were meant to meet again, she whispered, but I'm glad we did. I took her hand, and for the first time it felt natural, inevitable. Not a beginning, not an ending, simply a continuation. We spent that week together, wandering through museums, small chapels, forgotten gardens. We didn't speak of love directly. We didn't need to. It existed between us like the fresco beneath the plaster, hidden, enduring, waiting to be revealed by touch. When I returned to the monastery, she promised to visit, and she did, often. She became part of its rhythm, of its silence, of its warmth. Together, we began restoring a forgotten chapel nearby, not as work, but as prayer. Years later, when people asked about the colors of my last fresco, the soft gold, the pale blue, the quiet light that seemed to breathe, I told them they came from her. From the light between us, from love, found again after ruin. Now, as I write these words, she is here, reading by the window, her hair glowing in the last light of the day. The world outside fades into dusk, and the chapel bells begin to ring. And I realize, after all these years, all the loss, all the silence, that the truest restoration was never on the walls. It was within us. The years have thinned like parchment. The monastery stands unchanged, its bells still tolling, its walls still breathing the scent of time and prayer. Yet within me, seasons have folded quietly, one into another, like pages of a book nearing its end. Elena and I never married. We never needed to. Love, we discovered, can exist without ownership. Only presence. She kept her small house by the river, where wild lavender grew by the windows. I remained in my cottage, near the chapel, surrounded by pigments and brushes, by the ghosts of colors I once brought back to life. We shared our days, as one shares air, invisible, necessary. Sometimes she would read aloud in the evenings, her voice low and steady, while I painted in silence. Other times, we simply watched the light move across the walls, tracing the passage of hours like a slow divine brushstroke. When her health began to fail, it happened gently, as everything about her always had. She grew quieter, thinner, but her eyes, those deep, rain-colored eyes, never dimmed. One evening as the sun bled gold across the valley, she asked me to walk with her to the chapel. The air smelled of pine and smoke. We sat before the fresco we had restored together, the one that had been our last work, our shared devotion. "Do you ever think about what remains?" she asked. I took her hand. It was warm, fragile as parchment. "Only the light," I said. "Everything else fades. But light remembers." She smiled, faint, radiant. "I think love does too." She passed a few months later, in her sleep, her hand resting on an open book beside her bed. The page was marked by a single pressed wildflower. After the funeral, I couldn't paint for a long time. The brushes stood untouched, like pilgrims waiting for a miracle. I wandered the monastery's corridors, touching the cool stone walls, listening to the hum of centuries. Her absence was not silence. It was a different kind of presence. And then, one morning, I woke before dawn and went to the chapel. The light had just begun to rise, that soft, golden hush that comes before the world remembers itself. On the far wall, above the altar, the fresco of the woman, the same one I had uncovered years ago, caught the light in a way it never had before. For a moment, it seemed as if she were alive, breathing, her eyes filled with the same serene grace I had once seen in Elena's. I understood then that nothing we love is ever truly lost. It transforms, it continues, in color, in silence, in memory. I spent the next year painting one final piece, not for any church or commission, but for her, for us, a great mural on the back wall of the old chapel, where the light falls strongest at sunrise. I painted the valley, the monastery, the faint outline of two figures walking hand in hand toward the horizon, faceless, yet unmistakably us. When I finished, I sat beneath it for hours. The air smelled of dust and paint, of rain and stone. The bells began to ring, slow and distant, echoing through the hills. Now, as I write these last words, I am old. My hands tremble, my eyesight fades, but I am at peace. I have learned that love, like color, never truly disappears. It only deepens with time, becoming part of the light itself. Soon I will rest beside her in the small graveyard overlooking the valley. And when the dawn comes, I like to believe that the light will fall gently upon our names, as it does upon the walls we once restored, reminding the world that even what is broken can still be beautiful. Because love, when tended with silence and faith, is the only thing time cannot erase.